Ladies and gentlemen, but mostly gentlemen, we're diving back into another episode of Behind the Blue. This time we're going over the ins and outs of the Guns for Guardians Foundry Favorites video for Destiny 2. There's a lot to talk about for this one, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright, and the first thing to say, man oh man, this was a challenging video to make. Partly because it was a little bit longer than the previous Foundry Favorites videos. It wound up being about 8 minutes or so, with about a minute for the outro, a little bit for the intro. But it was a lot of meat and potatoes in this one, and it was pretty difficult, especially in certain sections that we'll talk about a little bit later. I was not willing to compromise at all. I had a vision, and I wanted to see that vision through and execute on it perfectly, and that made things very difficult for me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll start at the beginning, where things were pretty easy and pretty relaxed. This was a standard introduction where the clips on screen are related to what's going on in the script, and it's just very loosely setting up the premise for the entire video. For this one, the Vanguard weapons have been pretty solid from the start of Destiny 2 all the way a year later. They're still a solid series of weapons, but they're also not very exciting. You've got basic ass submachine guns, standard rocket launchers, regular assault rifles, nothing extravagant. And for this introduction, I wanted to juxtapose those very basic weapons with some of the more exciting ones, like the Colony and the World Line Zero is a sword that allows you to teleport around. It's very simple stuff, just nothing really crazy going on with these clips. But it's always good when the clips in the introduction are relating, or at least loosely related to what's being said. It helps to set up the premise, and that's something that I try to do as much as possible. So, as we move into the first real section of the video, we are talking about the Nameless Midnight, the Scout Rifle, and the Nightshade Pulse Rifle. And the cinematic section for these two guns was challenging to make, not because there was a high concept or any crazy visuals that I wanted to capture, but because it was the opposite, really. These two guns are boots on the ground, shoot your enemy, don't do any fancy stuff, just point and shoot and kill the target type weapons. And those weapons are visually a bit boring to watch, because it's just do it, just kill the guy. Like there's no need to do anything fancy here. So in order to make this short but sweet cinematic section pop a little bit, I opted to do a lot of quick cuts to pump up the action, make it feel like, ooh, what's this? Ooh, what's that? Just keep the brain engaged on as many different visuals as possible without overdoing it, without having it go by too fast. Something that I try to do whenever I have to edit something with quick cuts in it is to keep every single cut lasting for at least about a second, at least 1 second of each different visual. And we kind of see that at the beginning of the cinematic section for the Nightshade and Nameless Midnight. We start off, we segue into the section with a reload. We go from the gameplay footage, we're reloading our gun, bam, as soon as we put the magazine in, we switch over to the cinematic bit, and now we're killing an enemy, boom, immediately cut to killing another enemy, punch this guy in the face, keeping the action up as much as possible, and transition straight into the Nameless Midnight. We throw a grenade just to keep the energy up. Sometimes when I'm making these cinematic sections for the different weapons, I like to throw a grenade around. I like to add a melee in just to spice things up a little bit. And we saw that a lot with the Polaris Lance way back when, because the Polaris Lance is a scout rifle and it creates a visually boring gameplay. The gun isn't boring to use, but it can be a bit boring to watch since you're just pew, 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 shooting the gun, nothing fancy. But by adding slow motion, allowing the viewer to watch these beautiful explosions taking place slowed down so you can really soak it in tandem with the really exciting music, it makes for a visually engaging situation. So the same thing is happening here with the Nameless Midnight and the Nightshade. The quick cuts with the nightshade portion. The punching just adds a little bit of extra oomph to things. Then we got the grenade throw coming in, bam, slowing that down so we can watch that beautiful explosion, and then we go right back into normal speed. It's actually sped up just a little tiny bit in this section, but it's not super noticeable unless you really know about the speeds of the guns. Then we just go into a couple of quick cuts for reloads and another punch to the face, transition back into the speaking and finishing off the section. So yeah, it was quick. It felt action-packed, even though these guns are a little bit visually boring to watch. So yeah, that one, this one, there was no real high concept going on with the Nightshade and the Nameless Midnight. It was just a matter of giving intensity to two different weapons that otherwise don't have all that much intensity in their gameplay. But I think these two weapons in this section was a good counterplay to what comes immediately after it, which is the service revolver and the very, very conceptually rich narrative that went on with this weapon. This section was a lot of fun for me to make because I got to use a song and the style of music that I don't normally get to play around with. It was Latin music, and the premise for the service revolver is that because the gun has a very high hip fire accuracy and an airborne accuracy, it allows you to do pretty much whatever you want with your Guardian. If you want to jump around, you can jump around. If you want to be an acrobat, you can do that. Your gun will also work with you while you're doing that. So you jump around, boom, shoot a guy in the head, do a backflip, shoot him in the face. You can do all of that stuff. And I wanted to convey that through Latin music, because I've always felt like salsa, merengue, samba, all different types of musics like that, and the dancing that is associated with it is very liberating. It's very, very freeing. You move your hips around, you feel fluid and flowing. And I felt like that was a good way to evoke that feeling that I get with the service revolver, where it's the same thing. I feel like I'm able to flow very freely when I'm using a weapon like this. So we start off by being a little bit on the nose. The music cuts in and our character is doing a little bit of samba dancing. So we're just getting jiggy with it. And as we transition into the action shots, one thing that I wish I did more of for this section is more dodging, because I was playing as the hunter while I was recording this section, but I didn't incorporate dodging as much as I would like to. There were definitely some free flowing. It was definitely it definitely felt pretty loose in terms of where the audio sync was happening, but at the same time, I think the dodging and the extravagant motions that come from playing a hunter would have really brought home the idea that we're dancing when we use this weapon. We're really flowing from moment to moment and just allowing ourselves to be in this fluid and constantly changing moment instead of conforming to a more rigid play style. But in the end, it still looked pretty, but I don't think I executed on the concept as well as I could have. And that was pretty much the gist for it. If I could redo this section, I probably would, and I would definitely incorporate more dodging. And I may have also enjoyed being a bit more indulgent for this section and maybe stretching it out a little bit longer, because the song, it's such a nice song to just listen to, and just allowing myself to flow a little bit more and giving myself a little bit more breathing room to play with with all the different exciting motions that you can get with the Destiny 2 Hunter, because there's a lot of really fancy stuff you can do with this character that I just didn't show off enough of, that I definitely could have pushed this section a little bit further, but overall it's solid, but it could have been a little bit better. One thing that I really liked overall, though, about this video as a whole was that there was a lot of push and pull going on between the different sections. Each one had a feeling to it that was pulling on a different heartstring, so to speak. Where we go from the Nameless Midnight and the Nightshade, where we are boots on the ground, we're soldiers. Now all of a sudden we're Latin dancers. We're flowing with our guns. We're using this hand cannon that frees us to do amazing acrobatics while we fight. And then we transition into the next weapon, which is a fusion rifle, which is a kind of clunky, slow weapon. It's heavy. It feels very industrial, very modern, and even the music is shifting to something completely different. The Nameless Midnight and the Nightshade had a sort of soldier-inspired music. It feels like we're marching a little bit. Then of course we go into the Latin stuff where it's more free flowing. There's a car skidding outside. My goodness, what is he doing? But yeah, the Latin music, it's free flowing. It's loose, and it's human. It's part of the body. It's coming from you. And then the fusion rifle, it's raw science. It's industrial. It's heavy, and the music reflects that. And ideally, the editing reflects that as well, where we're being very rigid with our audio sync. We're not trying to touch on any offbeats. We're just going straight on the beat, thud, thud, thud. When the beat goes, that's when the gun fires, bang, 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 and that's what we see in that section. It wasn't too crazy, but it was a little bit tedious to make everything line up close to perfect, but it worked out. Now, if it isn't apparent at this point, I've been kind of breezing through the first 2/3 of the video, trying to rush towards the end, because this is where all the real work starts. We were definitely eating meat and potatoes at the beginning, but now we're getting grade A filet mignon with a side of bacon. Okay, we're getting the real deal meal right now for this final bit where we're talking about the origin story. This was a very big deal. It combined a lot of different stuff. It combined slow and emotional with intensity and action, a little bit of slow motion in there. It was very exciting. So we started off by showcasing a lot of the beautiful scenery in Destiny 2, but there was also a little bit of concept in this introduction to the origin story. Because this is the first weapon that you get in Destiny 2, the actual first gun that you get, I thought it was important to show off as much of the characters in the game as possible. So I wanted to show off Cayde, Ikora, and Zavala in the tower, because they are pretty much the first characters that you meet in Destiny 2. And if you're somebody that never played the Destiny franchise, they're the first characters that you meet, period, for the Destiny universe. So these guys are pretty much the beginning of your story with Destiny. So we start off by slow panning around the different areas in the tower where Cayde, Ikora, and Zavala like to hang out. And then the next transition, we go into this scene where we're flying in the hyperspace, about to exit it and go to a planet, and we transition into landing on the Leviathan raid. Now, this is a cutscene that they give you in the game when you land on Leviathan for the first time for the week, and I thought this cutscene was pretty relevant to the dialogue that was going on in the script, because it talks about the fact that the Vanguard weapons are stepping stones. You use these very basic guns in order to complete the raid so that you can get better guns. And I felt like this cutscene, especially while my character was holding the origin story in her hand, allowed you to feel this sense of we're looking towards greatness. We're looking towards ultimate potential and splendor. Loot beyond our wildest dreams lies ahead of us, and the origin story is going to help me get it. So no, I don't normally like to use cutscenes that are made by the developers when I do these Foundry Favorites videos, but I thought this one and a couple of others spoke so much to the concept that I wanted to convey that I decided to throw it in there. And then finally, there was a nice clip from the end of the game where Zavala is walking towards the posting that he stands at forever, and I just thought it was a really nice scene, so I used it in there. So let's go ahead and watch this little quick introduction. Now, another thing that I tried very hard to do with this section is I tried to keep the cinematic feel through as much of the video as possible. So even as we transition from what I consider the cinematic section into a more gameplay focused section, I'm trying to keep things on beat. I'm trying to sync up audio with actions as much as possible, and I'm using very extravagant looking gameplay. I mean, right here in this little clip, we've got the hunter jumping from a high point and then dodging, going back into the action. It just looks really cool. It's very out there gameplay, not necessarily something you expect to see with a pretty standard assault rifle, but it looks really good. But as we move on to a little bit later in the video, we have, I guess, another sort of cinematic section, but it's basically an introduction to the finale, where we transition again to a gameplay, not a gameplay, to a cutscene that was made by Bungie, where we see Cade, Ikora, and Zavala standing together. And another thing that I felt was relevant to the narrative that I was trying to tell about the origin story was we see Hawthorne walking on screen. And the premise for the origin story overall was that a weapon, if it has enough desire to push through and just try to fight its hardest, it can do great things. Even if it's not the best gun out there, even if it doesn't have the best perks and abilities, if it tries really hard, it can make it through. And Hawthorne as a character has a lot of those qualities because she's not a guardian. She doesn't have the ability to be constantly resurrected by her ghost, or she doesn't have magical powers. She can't harness void and solar energy. She's just a regular human, but she fights and she kicks ass. And I felt like just that little bit of a nod to the character of Hawthorne would mean something to people who played the game and paid attention to the story and her character specifically, who unfortunately doesn't get used all that much. After that little cutscene bit, we transition into talking about each of the different weapons and why they're so strong. So the Nameless Midnight, it punches so hard because it's been fighting with the origin story. Same goes for the Nightshade and all the other guns. They all work hard because they've been held to such a high standard by the origin story. So I showcase all of those different weapons firing in slow motion, so we can just see. It just looks pretty. Anytime there's slow motion, I do it because it looks pretty. Simple as that. But the real crazy stuff comes in when we move into the final real cinematic section, where the premise was that I wanted to convey as continuous of a chain of actions as I could, while unifying it all with the origin story. So we start off by throwing a grenade with our warlock, and then we start shooting a guy with the origin story. Then we do a quick cut to, again, shooting the origin story, but in a different location. Now, what you don't know as the viewer, if you're watching this the first time, is that I've also changed characters. So first we were a warlock. Now as we're shooting, we activate the barricade. Now we're a Titan. So once the barricade comes up, we do another cut. This time it's actually a crossfade, so it blends in a little bit smoother. But again, we're still firing the origin story, but this time we're a warlock. If you're watching it for the first time, I mean, we're not a warlock, we're a hunter this time. If you're watching it for the first time, you obviously don't know that. But as soon as the dodge comes out, we see that, oh, our character and our class keeps changing, but it's all being unified by the origin story. There's one uniting thread between all of this, and where it starts to really ramp up is when we start using these super abilities. This next section, we're firing the origin story from the hip, we're being overwhelmed by a bunch of Vex, and then finally, screw it, we activate the smash. This was the apex of the cinematic section. This is where the intensity is at its highest, and this is where things get a little bit tricky, because I had to keep that action up, and I had to keep that level of intensity. But after you do a smash with the Titan and the Striker super, there's no going up from that. That's kind of the best you're gonna get. So in order to keep the intensity there, and in order to keep a feeling of, okay, we're still at the top, maybe not as high, but we're still pretty up there, is I went back to the idea of using quick cuts to keep the intensity up there. So we transitioned back to the hunter again, and this time we're just throwing knives, smashing the cuts together, stabbing dudes in the face, and it's all coming by very quickly in order to keep the intensity there to match up with that massive Titan smash as best as possible. And then finally we close out with the warlock. We do a little bit of shooting, and one of my favorite transitions to do is after doing a blink, we cut to another blink in a different location, and then we fire off 2 Nova Bombs. I've done that specific edit multiple times. It's one of my favorite edits to do. I just like the way it looks. And then we wrap up the video there. As soon as the music reaches its finale, then everything goes into slow motion, and we just watch the origin story fire as the final monologue goes out. And then I guess maybe my favorite part of the video is that as things are lingering down, I'm being a little bit indulgent here. I'm just allowing the music to play. There's no dialogue. There's no nothing. It's coming to a close. But the final scene, we see the origin story with 20 bullets left in the magazine. It's just firing. It's firing. The song is coming to an end. And then cut to black, right as the origin story hits 0 bullets in the magazine, and the song officially ends with a nice ding. And it was all very pretty. So this section was where things were very difficult. I had a very specific idea that I wanted that continuous action, that origin story to unify all 3 of the character classes, and I wanted to showcase their specific strong suits. I wanted to showcase different unique aspects of the different character classes while unifying them all with the origin story, and collecting a chain of actions and then editing them all together in a way that felt like there was a continuity to it. It was very tedious, it was very difficult, but in the end it worked out okay. I think that's gonna just about do it. The last thing that we'll do before we wrap up, I did get a question from a gentleman named Yellow Guy. He wanted to know how I make the on-screen overlays for the different weapons and their perks and traits. I do it all in Photoshop. Essentially, it's a bunch of text boxes and image icons that I got from DestinyTracker.com, and the layout is just something I came up with, and each of these text boxes are just pretty much placed on screen based on the layout that I wanted to have. All these lines look like an absolute mess. Let me clean this up a little bit so that it's a little bit more legible. Okay, there we go. That's a little bit cleaner. It's still kind of a clusterfuck, to be honest, but it's fair enough. So yeah, it's just based on a very loose grid system, because it has to change based on it changes from weapon to weapon based on how many lines of text are required to explain each perk, and because some guns, they'll have 3 or 4 different attributes on a specific optic, and that changes the way the layout has to look. Some guns only have 1 bit of information on an optic, and it's a very flexible grid system. I move it around based on what I need, but essentially just make this in Photoshop. If I go ahead and mute that, this is what the on-screen overlay looks like in Photoshop. Then I render it or export it, and then we bring it into Vegas Pro. We put it down, and we've got 3 different layers for video or image footage. So at the bottom layer, we have a blurred out video clip of gameplay. In the center layer, we have the service revolver graphic, and at the top layer, we have, if I mute the other ones, we can see it's just a box with the gameplay footage. And when we have all the different layers together, we see the finished product is this section of gameplay with the service revolver information off to the side. So we can see all of the perks in action as they're being talked about and as they're being used in game. And just a subtlety that you may or may not have noticed, but the perks that are currently active on the guns are at a higher opacity than the perks that are inactive. So for the service revolver, the clips on screen, all of them, I am using the True Sight HCS and armor piercing rounds. And the Crossfire HCS is a lower opacity, so it's a little bit harder to see. And same goes for the accurized rounds, because they're currently not in use. So that's just it's a subtlety that you may or may not have noticed. It's just graphic design stuff to convey information or whatever. But yeah, that's the gist of it. It's not an official how-to Photoshop guide or how-to Sony Vegas guide, but yeah, that's the gist of how it was made, and that's how I've made all of the different on-screen graphics for the different guns. So yeah, that's gonna be it, man. We did it. We finished the first season of Foundry Favors, and it was really fun and exciting, and I especially enjoyed the origin story bit. It was a lot of fun to tell that story of a gun that's trying its hardest to stay relevant and is trying to whoop ass and make a name for itself, even though it's got these flaws to it. And I think it's a story that can kind of resonate with a lot of people as well. That's why it was such a fun narrative to tell, because it's one that I think can speak to everyone. So yeah, that's gonna wrap it up. Come Forsaken, there's gonna be a lot of new guns to explore, like I said up at the top. But yeah, we're gonna wrap it up here by saying, the name of the game is Destiny 2. The name of the channel is iBluairJgR. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Boy, oh boy, it's really hot today. I'm going to go dunk my head in a bucket of ice. Thank you for watching. Let me know how you feel about this, if you enjoyed it. Let me know how you feel about the Foundry Favorites series and what you're looking forward to in the future with the new Foundry Favorites that are going to come out, with the new guns and everything, the new exotic reviews. Is there anything in particular that you're really excited about for Forsaken, but also that you're excited for me to go over in Forsaken, something that you want to hear my opinion about for the expansion pack? So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.